an original story narrated exclusively for love beyond words. The morning Eleanor Whitmore realized her life was collapsing began quietly, with the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the tall windows of Whitmore House. The once grand estate sat on a hill overlooking acres of fading land, its gardens overgrown and its fountains dry. Years ago, the house had been filled with music, laughter, and visitors from across the county. Now silence lived in its corridors. The servants walked more softly than usual, and even the wind outside seemed hesitant to disturb the fragile calm. Eleanor stood by the drawing-room window, her hands folded together, watching the mist roll slowly across the field her family had owned for generations. Behind her, her Uncle Charles sat stiffly in a velvet chair, a stack of papers resting heavily on his lap. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the careful tone of someone delivering news that could not be softened. Her father's debts were worse than anyone had realized. Loans had been taken quietly over many years, and now the creditors were demanding repayment. Within a few weeks, Whitmore House would be seized. The land would be sold. The family name, once respected and secure, would become a cautionary story whispered in drawing rooms across the region. Eleanor listened without interrupting, though each word felt like a stone settling deeper inside her chest. She had known the situation was serious since her father's death, but hearing the truth spoken aloud made the loss feel final. The estate would disappear, and with it the life she had always known. Yet her uncle had not come only to deliver bad news. There was, he explained carefully, one possible solution. A man named Lord Halston had expressed interest in acquiring Whitmore House before the creditors forced the sale. Halston was wealthy, influential, and widely feared for his ruthless ambition. His offer came with a condition that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with quiet dread. He expected her to marry him once the property transferred into his hands. The proposal was not presented as romance or even convenience. It was simply the price of survival. Eleanor walked slowly across the room as her uncle finished speaking. She knew Halston by reputation. Women avoided him. Men tolerated him only when necessary. His charm was thin and practiced, hiding a calculating cruelty that made most people uneasy. The thought of belonging to him felt like stepping willingly into a cage. When she refused the idea outright, her uncle sighed with weary understanding. He admitted there was one other option, though it would be far less respectable in society's eyes. If Eleanor married quickly, before the creditors seized the estate, she could legally leave Whitmore House with her husband. The scandal of the estate's collapse would fade more quickly if she were no longer attached to the property. But finding a respectable gentleman willing to marry a nearly ruined woman within days was impossible. Only one man remained available for such an arrangement: Thomas Hale, the stable boy. The suggestion hung in the room like an absurd joke that no one dared laugh at. Thomas had worked at Whitmore House for 3 years, arriving quietly one autumn morning asking for employment. He had been hired to help manage the horses and had proven reliable, hard-working, and unusually reserved. Eleanor had seen him many times in passing across the courtyard. He rarely spoke more than necessary, and yet there was something quietly composed about him that made people respect him without quite knowing why. Still, the idea of marrying him seemed unimaginable. A Whitmore had never married beneath their rank, yet the alternative was Lord Halston. The more Eleanor considered the situation, the clearer the choice became. Within an hour, she had made her decision. When Thomas was called to the house that afternoon, he arrived with the same calm expression he always carried. Dust from the stables still clung faintly to his coat, and the wind had pushed his dark hair slightly out of place. He listened silently as Eleanor explained the situation herself. She expected surprise or hesitation, but Thomas simply watched her with steady gray eyes. When she finished, he asked only one question: "If you marry me, you understand your life will change completely." Eleanor nodded. "It already has." Thomas studied her for a moment longer before agreeing. The simplicity of his answer somehow felt more reassuring than any dramatic declaration. The wedding was arranged 2 days later in the small village chapel. There were no invitations, no elaborate gowns, and no music echoing through the halls of Whitmore House. Eleanor wore a simple ivory dress that had once belonged to her mother. The lace had yellowed slightly with age, but it remained elegant in its quiet way. Thomas stood beside her in a clean dark coat borrowed from the stable master. The priest spoke the traditional vows while a few curious villagers watched from the back of the chapel, whispering softly about the strange union unfolding before them. When Eleanor said, "I do," she felt something unexpected settle inside her. Not joy exactly, but relief. The choice had been made. Her future, uncertain as it was, now belonged to her rather than to Lord Halston. After the ceremony, Eleanor left Whitmore House for the final time. She did not look back as the carriage carried her down the long gravel road lined with old oak trees. The house faded slowly into the distance, its tall windows reflecting the pale afternoon sky. Thomas sat quietly across from her during the journey, giving her space to absorb the weight of everything she had lost. Eventually, they arrived at a modest cottage on the edge of farmland several miles away. It was small but well-maintained, with white walls, a stone chimney, and a narrow garden beginning to bloom with early spring flowers. Eleanor stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth of a fire crackling gently in the hearth. The space was simple yet peaceful, a sharp contrast to the grand but empty hall she had just left behind. That evening passed quietly. They shared a modest meal prepared earlier by a caretaker who lived nearby. Conversation between them remained polite but limited, the natural distance of two strangers joined by circumstance. As night deepened, Eleanor began to feel the strange reality of her new life settling around her. She was now married to a man she barely knew. The world she had grown up in was gone. Yet Thomas's calm presence created an unexpected sense of safety. He never spoke with arrogance or pity, and he treated her with a quiet respect that eased her fears. Later that night, as the fire burned lower and the house fell silent, Thomas stood near the window looking out into the dark fields beyond the cottage. Eleanor noticed that his expression had grown unusually thoughtful. After a moment, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a small velvet pouch. Turning toward her, he spoke gently. "Before this night continues, there is something you deserve to know." Eleanor watched with quiet curiosity as he opened the pouch and poured its contents into his palm. A ring caught the firelight and gleamed brightly. It was not an ordinary ring. The gold band was thick and carefully engraved with an intricate crest Eleanor recognized instantly. Every noble family in the region knew that symbol. It belonged to one of the most powerful houses in the country. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization formed. Thomas placed the ring on the wooden table between them and met her eyes calmly. "My real name is not Thomas Hale," he said softly. "My name is Alexander Hale, and I am the Duke of Ravensshire." For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. The words felt impossible, as if they belonged to some elaborate story rather than the quiet room around them. She looked again at the ring, then back at the man she had married that morning. The calm strength she had noticed before suddenly made sense in a way that left her stunned. "A duke! Working in the stables?" she finally whispered. Alexander nodded slightly. He explained that after inheriting the title from his father 3 years earlier, he had grown tired of the endless politics and shallow ambitions of high society. Determined to understand the world beyond aristocratic privilege, he had traveled through the countryside under a false name, taking ordinary work wherever he could. Whitmore House had been one of the places where he chose to stay longer than expected. At first, he had simply been curious about the estate, but over time he had observed Eleanor quietly from a distance. Unlike many nobles, she treated servants with genuine kindness and carried her responsibilities without arrogance. When her father died and the estate's financial problems began to surface, Alexander watched how she handled the crisis. She never blamed others or sought sympathy. Instead, she worked tirelessly to protect the people around her, even when it became clear she might lose everything. When he heard about Lord Halston's intentions, Alexander realized the danger she faced. He had been prepared to reveal his identity and intervene. But when Eleanor chose to marry a stable boy simply to preserve her independence and dignity, he understood the depth of her character. "I needed to know who you truly were," Alexander said quietly. "Not the woman society expected you to be, but the woman you remained when everything else was taken away." Eleanor sat slowly beside the fire, absorbing the truth of his words. The entire day replayed in her mind with new meaning. The calm way he had accepted the marriage, the steady confidence he carried, the strange feeling that he belonged nowhere near the stables. At last she looked up at him with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant amusement. "So, I married a duke without realizing it." Alexander allowed himself a faint smile. "You married a man who admired your courage long before you knew his name." The fire crackled softly between them as the silence settled again. Finally, Alexander lifted the ring and placed it gently in Eleanor's hand. "Everything that belongs to me now belongs to you as well," he said. "The title, the estates, the future. If you wish it." Eleanor studied the ring for a moment, feeling the heavy gold against her palm. Then she stood and walked toward him. Instead of keeping the ring, she pressed it back into his hand. "I didn't marry a duke," she said softly. "I married the man who carried saddles through the rain and treated me with respect when I had nothing left." Alexander looked at her with quiet warmth in his eyes. "And which man would you like to keep?" Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. "Both." Within weeks, the truth of their marriage spread through society like wildfire. Nobles who had once pitied Eleanor suddenly realized she had become the Duchess of Ravensshire. Lord Halston abandoned his plans immediately, furious that the woman he intended to control had become far more powerful than he could ever hope to challenge. Whitmore House itself was quietly purchased back through Alexander's influence, though Eleanor chose not to return to live there. The old estate remained a symbol of the past, while the small cottage where their unusual marriage began became a reminder of how their story truly started. For Eleanor, the most surprising discovery was not Alexander's title or wealth, but the partnership that grew between them. Their marriage had begun as an escape from ruin, yet it gradually became something stronger. Alexander continued to value the lessons he had learned while living as an ordinary worker, and Eleanor's grounded perspective helped guide the responsibilities of the duchy with compassion and wisdom. Together, they built a life that balanced power with humility, privilege with understanding. And years later, when people told the strange story of the heiress who married a stable boy only to discover he was a duke, Eleanor would simply smile and say the truth was even simpler than that. On the night she believed she had lost everything, she had unknowingly gained the one thing far more valuable than wealth or titles. A partner who saw her not for her fortune or her family name, but for the strength of the heart she carried when the world fell apart.